come with you, George?
Tea for George?
Tea for George?
Can I not go first?
Yeah.
Who's chair? It's yours.
I am.
Can I not go first? Give me a minute to get
Okie dokie. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our latest panel, From Research to Regulation, how the UK can become a world leader in cannabinoid innovation. I better get used to saying that word, because I imagine I might have to say it once or twice throughout the rest of the panel. The UK is already the second largest market in the world for CBD products, and we have a world-leading bioscience industry. Today's discussion is an attempt not, as you may have seen at other panels or in other articles discussing legalising sort of cannabis for recreational use. This is strictly focused on the innovation surrounding cannabinoids and whether we can create a market for them here in the UK. And so I'm going to be joined in this merry discussion by George Freeman, the Member of Parliament for Mid-Norfolk, Steve Moore, the Strategic Counsel, that's a very glamorous name, from the Centre for Medicinal Cannabis, Blair Gibbs, who is the Public Policy Consultant and former Prime Ministerial Advisor, and Dr. Grace Best-Hopley, is the Chief Scientific Officer at the North West Pharma Tech. So, I'm William Exton, as I say, the Assistant Editor of Conhome, and the format of today's events will be thus. After I finish my opening monologue, we will have a series of introductory speeches by the various panellists. I will then ask a couple of questions, and then we'll turn over to you guys to ask questions from the floor. I will say in advance when asking questions, though I'm disproving my own advice here, please avoid a monologue and try to sort of keep it short and sharp so we can ask as many questions as possible. So, without further ado, and to give you more of the science and sort of terms of today's debate, I will pass over to Steve.
Thank you, William, and thanks for hosting this event. So, I think in his opening comments, William said what we don't want to talk about today, which is what's been discussed in various ways at other fringe events at the conference, which is around recreational cannabis. There's no great public clamour for legalising cannabis in the UK. There's no really developed political organising around it. So I think at the moment, for now, and for the purposes of this event, I think we'll take that off the table. Instead, what we're going to want to explore is the economic potential of cannabinoids, both as pharmaceutical products, as medical products, and as over-the-counter products. And I'll say a little bit about the kind of how that industry has sort of come about over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, and what the kind of impediments are to its growth, and I think others will be able to add to it. So, in my writing about this, I've often described this as a kind of accidental revolution in the UK, because the creation of this industry was not designed. It didn't appear in any party political manifesto. There was no ever any government commitment to undertake this. This was really, the industry that's come together was really formed by a mixture of lobbying and activism over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. And I mean, the two real kind of key moments in recent years was the change of the law in 2018, which allowed cannabis to be prescribed for the first time by specialist clinicians, and the decision to regulate CBD products as food under the food regulations under the novel foods framework, which was inherited from the European Union. So those two things happened really as the consequence of many of lobbying, activism, and things like that. A lot of public concern about, particularly in the former case, about epileptic children and being denied access to medicine, and in the latter case, just the sheer scale and ubiquity of CBD products that were being sold in every pharmacy, health food shop, and supermarkets without having gone through what you would expect to be the basic rudimentary regulatory process. So I think where we are at the moment is that we have a medical market that allows patients to be prescribed mainly in the private sector. We have 2 licensed medicines that have been approved by NICE for prescribing in the NHS, and we have 12,000 CBD products that have been placed on what's called a public list by the Food Standards Agency, which allows them to continue through the regulatory process, which will probably complete sometime next year when you will have the first formally approved consumer products. But all of this is happening in a very disparate way. There's never really been any recognition or acknowledgement of this industry in public policy. You won't probably find anybody in Whitehall, a single civil servant in Whitehall, who's got a vested interest in the growth and development of this sector. And yet here we are with a sector which has got a valuation of something between 700 and 800 million pounds for the sales, and yet it's got no public policy stewardship. It's running into all sorts of public policy impediments, which Blair will probably cover in his talk. And it's what we initiated earlier this year was a report which would take a look at all those kind of regulatory challenges and how you could begin to nurture and grow this industry. And the premise behind that was that there was still an opportunity for Britain to develop a marked competitive advantage in the development of R&D in cannabinoids, because although there's been lots of liberalisation going on, notably in North America and some other countries, what you haven't seen is a country taking a marked competitive advantage in terms of R&D in this space. And indeed, Britain is the home to the most successful medical cannabis company, probably the most successful legal cannabis company in history, in GW Pharmaceuticals, who were acquired last year by an Irish pharmaceutical company for £8 billion. So there is a history here of government being able to facilitate and nurture and develop probably the only unicorn in this space. So we have a track record of doing that. I think, but we now need to kind of build on it. I think by the fact we're the first jurisdiction in the world that's going to be regulating these CBD products. So again, during the course of the next year, we'll be the first country that will have formally approved CBD as a food, and that offers all sorts of potential, because I think increasingly what we're seeing now is CBD companies who want to explore its use as an ingredient rather than a product. Most of the CBD sales at the moment offer CBD products in vapes or in a bottle, but I think increasingly the companies that we're onboarding at the ACI are companies who are focused in on exploiting it as an ingredient in the way that people started to do with omega-3 20 years ago. So I think that's where I think it gets extremely interesting and where the potential is. But as I say, none of this can really happen without dealing with the impediments imposed upon this particular product category by the Misuse of Drugs Act, by the fact that it's being managed across 3 government departments without any coordination or without any coherence. So earlier this year, we commissioned a report by Professor Chris Hodges. If you Google the Hodges Review, you can see that report. It was published in June. Chris has gone on to become the chair of the government's Regulatory Horizons Board, so he's now in a very influential position in terms of thinking about the future of regulation across a whole range of areas. And that set out a very detailed proposal for how we could recognise this industry exists and how we could bring about some stewardship for it within Whitehall. And those conversations, George actually, who was then the Minister of Science and Innovation, spoke at the launch of the review, and we're continuing to have those conversations with government about how we take forward the many recommendations of the report. But so at the moment, I think really in essence, I think what I wanted to convey at this event was this: if we move away, if we sort of remove the conversation about, which has been going on forever, about legalising cannabis, and focus instead on its potential, the potential R&D of what we call the potential R&D opportunities that this creates, and with a bit of public policy support, I think we can nurture a very successful industry here in the UK.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. And now, George.
Thank you very much, and thanks for convening us. Many things go on at conference. Not all of them are best discussed. But one of the great things about conference is the chance to have conversations like this on the fringe about topics that you wouldn't get much time in Parliament for. We will begin to get some time for it, but to bring experts, policymakers and interested parties together. So thank you for putting us here. Look, for those who don't know me, my background was elected 2010, 12 years in which I've consistently, and some would say boringly, just gone on and on about science, technology, research and innovation. It seems to me the only way we're going to get out of this boom-bust cycle of structural deficit and the sort of economic malaise, the deep structural economic malaise that's holding this country back. And I had a 15-year career in mainly med tech, some clean tech, some agri-tech, before coming to Parliament. And I've just completed my 4th ministerial role. So I was Minister for Life Sciences in the Coalition, Minister for Agri-Tech, Minister for the Future Transport, and then most recently Minister for UK Science, Research, Tech and Innovation. And I'm now out of government, and I thought about not coming to this conference this week because I feel like it's sort of feels like quite an ideological small group holding a conference, and anyone who doesn't subscribe is not invited. But I'm elected as a Conservative MP. I was elected on the 2019 manifesto. I'm passionate about growth. I agree with much of Kwasi's analysis of Treasury orthodoxy being broken, and I deeply think that unless we get the right sort of growth, we are in serious trouble as an economy. So this 2 days, I'm here making the case that this party has got to be the party of growth, but not just any old growth. Given the situation we're in, tightening global supply chains, huge geopolitical conflicts over science and technology, China beginning to put some pressure on, for example, silicon chip supplies coming out of Taiwan, Ukraine has exposed us to all sorts of critical mineral problems. We need to be much more resilient about our economic growth and recognize that our science and our technology is a fundamental strength for us as a global science superpower, and we're actually home to a number of sectors that could grow not at 1 or 2%, but at 20, 30, 50% a year, 100% a year. And that's the only way we're going to get out of this boom and bust cycle of structural deficits, is get our economy properly geared to innovation. Innovation in the private sector and in the public sector. So we turn the NHS from an old-fashioned, sclerotic, cardboard, patient safety undermining bureaucracy, staffed by some brilliant people in almost impossible conditions, to a proper modern healthcare system that uses our medtech innovation to be much more efficient, screen better, diagnose better, and treat smarter. So I'm completely passionate about this agenda, and it seems to me if as we do, we need growth pretty quickly, then you can try some trickle-down service economy economics, but we've done that many times. It tends to end, goes boom and bust, and we did promise the public that's not what we do. So for all of those reasons, I think it would be much better to look at the sectors of the economy we've got that are poised to deliver huge growth and harness it and support it. And it was with that in mind that 18 months ago, when Boris asked me if I would lead a very important piece of work for him on defining the regulatory benefit of Brexit, I said yes on the basis that, of course, sure, there's some daft laws we could get rid of, some EU ones and some UK ones, but the real opportunity is to lead in the regulation of new sectors, to set out agile, digital, smart, innovative regulations and use our Brexit freedom to become a much smarter regulator in a whole bunch of new sectors, from space, from satellites to nutraceuticals, functional foods, clinical trials, digital health. The lack of a clear regulatory framework holds back investment. And one of the sectors that I slightly controversially put in that report was this sector. And that's why I'm delighted to be here and supporting you. Look, I've got 3 specific points very quickly I want to make. The first is, to Steve's point, I think it's quite important to be clear as we advocate for this, what we're suggesting. I tend to divide this sector into 3. There's the cannabinoid pharmaceuticals. That's pharmaceutical grade medicines that have been through all the 15-year, $2 billion pharmaceutical levels of isolating the active, turning it into an oral compound, putting it through pharmaceutical clinical trials, which is what GW Pharma have done. Now, some of those companies are a bit sniffy about the rest because they think it's a cheat's way of bypassing the pharmaceutical grade medicines. It's not at all. I just think we can have both. You can have the pharmaceutical grade, which has worked very successfully. Then you've got a second pillar, which is where the CBD sector really is. I think that's a mixture of some CBD medicines, the medical applications of CBD products, the products, and as Steve says, the ingredients. And then there's a third category, which is the sort of psychedelics, the hallucinogens, the applications of a whole raft of compounds in the medical setting. I think it is legitimate, and it definitely merits more research, but that is not what I'm talking about here. I'm focusing on that middle section, the mainstream CBD market. And if the Prime Minister and Chancellor want growth, boy, can that sector deliver growth. The Canadians have got ahead with quite a big start. We've we've done pretty much everything in the UK until Steve and this campaign got going to basically shoot ourselves in the foot. We've allowed Home Office regulations to make it very difficult to manufacture and develop CBD products here. People are allowed to use them, so it's a very, very significant import market coming into the country. And if we grip it properly, we'd have a massive growth industry right here in the UK. There aren't many times in life you get a huge growth industry that wants to be here. You've got massive consumers using the product here, and all you've got to do is make it possible to grow and process and manufacture the product here. And it is a huge opportunity. I mean, I don't know what the latest numbers are, but it's well north of 500-600 million. And as the market grows internationally, it'll become a lot more. And so that's the first point. There is a huge, genuine business opportunity. Don't take it from me, by the way. Take it from... I had two interesting meetings I'll share with you. When I was Minister for Life Science, I said, look, we should look at this CBD medicine. Minister's a terribly bad idea. I said, well, why is it a bad idea? Well, the Home Office don't like it. Well, that's not a good reason not to do it. I really want to have a round table, I said, with the cannabinoid, cannabis medicines people. There's no taxonomy. And as a minister, they love to keep putting things in your inbox and hope you'll forget. And every 2 or 3 months, I'd say, when are we having that round table? And eventually, they forced to organise it. So they did it on a Friday, thinking I couldn't make it. So I cancelled my constituency day and went downstairs. I said, I don't want hippies. I want genuine, I want the little old lady in Hampstead who's relying on CBD tea bags to deal with her pain and her neuralgia. Well, I walked into what could only be described as the sort of founding committee of Woodstock, 1969. I mean, these were heavy, heavy recreational users. They were great company. And I went around the table and asked them how they discovered the medicinal benefits, and they more or less all said, well, I've been smoking weed all my life, mate, but I've got a bit of sciatica. And I said to my officials, that is exactly not what I meant. What I meant was the people who are not interested in recreational CBD, but have genuinely found it to have a medicinal benefit. That just tells you how geared the system is to not having the debate. We've come a long way since then, thanks to this campaign. And the other conversation, I got a phone call from Turnip Townsend. You remember, well, not Turnip Townsend, because he was driving the agricultural revolution in the 1600s in Norfolk, but his great-great-great-great-grandson, the Marquis of Townsend, Tom Rainham, who is the biggest landowner in Norfolk, farms huge areas in my constituency, and he said, George, I really want to talk to you about something. I said, yes, of course, Tom. He said, I really want to get into cannabis. And I said, Tom, have you called the right George? I'm not sure your MP is the person to have this conversation with. He said, no, I'm absolutely serious. This area is covered with turkey huts, old poultry units that are really good for growing industrial hemp, and we should be getting into this. It's a huge market with huge environmental benefits. It's a huge... Well, I mean, you know, when one of the biggest landowners in Norfolk says, I want to get into this as an agricultural crop with huge benefits, then I think we should take it seriously. And so that's my first point. Second point, the Hodges Review basically sets it out. Any minister who wants to know what to do, it's sort of all in there, and I was delighted to appoint Chris and to support that, and I hope that this survives the change of government. And the last point I'd make is this is part of a broader, very exciting area called nutraceuticals, so where food meets medicine. And you know, increasingly we're seeing products from Danone yogurts to cardiovascular preventing broccoli to nutraceutically enhanced carrots. I used to be a director of Elsom Seeds, the UK's last family-owned agricultural seeds business. This is a real exciting area where we're using trait science to modify health benefits of plants. And in the dairy sector, they're doing the same. We don't regulate it, so regulatory, we say if it's a white powder, it's a medicine, if it's long and orange, it's a carrot. And there's a huge market, and we could be leading in the regulation of nutraceuticals, and it's all about data. And ultimately, what I'd like us to do is to license products where there is no evidence to suggest that they will be harmful. Data, 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 everyone wearing Fitbits, doing patient-observed outcomes, digital health, and use the data to drive enlightened regulation. And it would draw billions into this country and create a really interesting agricultural crop and deliver all sorts of side benefits. But if we want to go for growth, we can't ignore growth that's already happening, and we'd be very well advised to take this sector seriously.
Well, going for growth in more than one sense, in the case of your farmer friend. But yes, so thank you, George. That was absolutely fascinating. And now I'll have the opening remarks from Blair.
Thank you, Will. So if you don't know me, I'm not a scientist, I'm a policy advisor, and When I was last in a position of any influence, I was for about 18 months in the number 10 policy unit under the last Prime Minister and covered Home Affairs. And of course, within Home Affairs is all the questions around how we tackle drugs and how we regulate and the law around all types of drugs. Prior to that, I'd obviously been interested in this for some time and passionate about sort of drug law reform for many years. The first thing I should say, because when you tell people what you've done, they assume that you've had a huge amount of influence and impact, and the first thing is to apologize for not having moved the dial any further than I did. My excuse for that is a global pandemic, which distracted most of the people who were in any position to listen. Cannabis reform was and is important to me, and it was being talked about. The former Prime Minister used to remember one discussion where he referred to, he was a bit fed up actually, he kept going for runs around St James's Park and kept smelling the ganja, as he called it. But as Steve rightly said at the start, let's set legalisation aside. I'm personally on record as favouring it. I think the Canadians are sensible and they've done quite a good job. I think eventually it will happen. The public opinion is moving that way remorselessly, I think. About a third of over 55 support it now, and even a quarter of over 65s support it. So that probably only goes one way, and it may take a decade, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. It's not going to happen under this government. Even Germany won't have recreational sales for at least 2 years, maybe longer. And it's also a distraction from the fact that we have a legal market now, which is gradually gathering pace, and awareness is growing. It is often misunderstood. It's often conflated with this recreational legalization question as well, which doesn't help. And as Steve said, it was slightly accidental. You know, it took the bravery of a newly appointed Home Secretary to make the leap and to make medical cannabis prescribable in the UK. And I think combination of timing and personality in that case was very helpful. Somebody, I think, at the previous panel discussion the other day talked about the lack of evidence. But of course, it was the Home Secretary who commissioned the UK's Chief Medical Officer to review the evidence. And she was quite clear in her conclusion that there was now sufficient evidence. So let's just put that to bed, I think. So we have medical cannabis. We are right to have it. We have a private market predominantly, and it's growing. We don't know by how much a month, but it's scaling based on the figures we have quite consistently. The last figures are only up to November of last year, about 5,000 prescriptions a month. In 2019 and 2020, by the way, there were dozens a month. So it's growing, and that's a market. There is a market there. It's a market that's dominated by imported products. It's not very transparent, but it's there. And apparently, according to polling that we did for the Hodges review, where we're interested in just sort of how sort of mysterious is this sector to the public? How much do they really not know about it? Well, in fact, 1 in 6 people claimed in that poll to know somebody who had benefited from a medical cannabis prescription. And with social change, you don't need 50% of the population to be experiencing it. You only need 10% probably to be directly experiencing it in their family, and to be able to talk with some passion and some knowledge about it for it to start to change people's minds. So as those prescriptions grow, the industry itself will get more clout, it will get more profile. And then, of course, as was mentioned, hemp as well is hugely interesting to me. I think there's also more of a history of hemp and the industry of hemp in this country. If you're a historian like I was, it's a fascinating example of an industry that's time has come again, and it can be carried along, I think, under this drive towards net zero and the green agenda quite nicely. Somebody who's here in the audience, this is already out there publicly, but he showed me that hemp was until recently, it's just been harvested, but it's been grown very close to the Prime Minister's country house in Chequers. So, this is not some alien foreign crop. This has a very deep pedigree in this country. And it could be fantastic for the rural economy too. So all of this will gradually grow awareness and understanding of the opportunities. But my point is really that normalization takes a lot of time. This is going to happen both bottom up and top down. And from my experience in government, there are some major barriers that are top-down barriers that honestly do need to be addressed if we're going to seize this opportunity. The first is that government officials, and by that I mean predominantly Home Office officials, are by nature sort of securocrats. So don't forget, this is a plant that's bracketed with narcotics in criminal law, and it's treated really as a dangerous drug. And for that reason, the Home Office is never that interested in economic growth, it has to be said. And even in the business of issuing licenses, they're not that bothered about whether something creates jobs or not. But it's more of a hostility about if you like, the motivation of the industry, some concern about the grayness of the market around the edges, concern about North America and the connection between the American industry and imports into Europe. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why they might be sort of hostile to it. But I think one thing I can claim is that I was probably the first person to host a meeting in Number 10 where Home Office officials were made to come and talk about how they plan to regulate CBD. So I would want to see much more engagement from government officials. Rather than thinking about it in terms of containment, we need to see it in terms of what they can do to support the nurturing of this sector. Because there's always going to be a role for the Home Office. There's always going to be a role for enforcement, clear rules, keeping out of the market bad actors, and guarding against diversion. You know, if you want a large homegrown cannabis industry, then you have a role for the Home Office and for the police and for trading standards, etc. But I increasingly concluded that half of what they were doing wasn't even something they should be doing. Licensing of farmers should be clearly in DEFRA. Licensing or oversight of cannabis, licenses for cultivation of cannabis medicines should be in DHSC. Or even in a separate agency all to itself, where it could develop the expertise, attract the scientists and the career officials who wanted to specialize and nurture it that way. So we do need a change in the Whitehall mindset. We would like to see more of a homegrown industry. The truth is that there are some great businesses in the UK, but they're not competing on a level playing field at all. And that's partly because the supply chains are so opaque. And there's not traceability in the way that there should be. And I think consumers would want that anyway. We want proactive regulators, not just ones who sit on their hands and wait for the media to draw attention to bad actors. We need much more transparency around licensing. I mean, it's really bizarre to me that a licensing decision, which is a quasi-judicial decision taken in secret by career officials and just rubber-stamped by the Crime and Policing Minister, is an entirely black box exercise. You know, I now live in Canada where they have a legal medical and adult use market, but consider even Australia. Other Commonwealth jurisdictions where the common law reigns, it seems bizarre that such an important process with a commercial consequence for the market, but also involving taxpayers' money and the impact on local residents, is a completely secret process. There are nothing's codified about how you get a license, what you need to do to achieve a license, how long it takes, what tests you have to pass to meet it. They can keep people on the run around for years before making an arbitrary decision, which is then not explained and not appealable. And ultimately, we're going to need a lot more licenses. We're going to need a lot more homegrown businesses with licenses issued by the Home Office to do that job legally in the UK. So that whole process needs to be made a lot more transparent. Health Canada's process is spelled out on their website, and you can follow it, and there's guidance documents and support if you need it, and a phone number to ring. So yeah, there's that as well. And then enforcement, of course, has to be part of the mix, but it can't be the only thing the Home Office are interested in. Lastly, investment and R&D. So Innovate UK are busy issuing grants, and some of them have gone to companies involved in cannabinoid research. During the COVID crisis, and with furlough support and bounce back loans and things, some of those went to cannabis companies. So obviously in government, one hand doesn't always know what the other hand's doing, but it's very uncoordinated. There should definitely be a much more strategic role for innovation grant funding to cannabinoid businesses, which should all obviously come through Bays and not from anywhere else. And lastly, and this is what we said in the Hodges review, which is that this is, as George said, a high growth sector of the future. Our competitors are already ahead of us. We are competing with Canada, we're competing with Israel, we're competing with Australia, we're competing with Germany, and we should see it in those terms. So that's not even that radical an idea. We're not asking the British government to place a big bet on something that no other country is doing. It's the space industry 20 years ago. We now have a thriving space industry that generates tens of thousands of jobs. We're going to have rockets and satellites launching from the British Isles soon. So if 20 years ago the government had not decided this was an industry of the future that would pay back and would deliver growth, then it wouldn't be where it is now. And I think we have to see the cannabis sector in the same way.
Excellent, thank you for that. And finally, can I go to Grace for your introductory remarks?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Will. And I guess I will start by saying I am a scientist. And thank you for having me, because sometimes as scientists we're not always heard when talking about things that largely we're the ones doing the research on. So firstly, I come to this as an academic, having spent near on 10 years now working in cannabis research, looking at the effects of cannabis and cannabinoids on the body and the effects that they have, both positive and negative, largely in the field of psychiatry and mental health. And secondly, now as the Chief Scientific Officer for NW Pharmatech, where we're looking to develop novel drug delivery methods for things like cannabinoids, so that we can improve the way that we administer them so that they're more effective. And secondly, to do rigorous clinical studies and clinical trials into cannabinoids and their efficacy for a number of conditions which are a huge financial and personal burden to many, many people. And so looking at the requirements there in order to license cannabinoid medicines in this country. And having sort of stepped away from a purely academic background and into more of a commercial field, and looking at the cannabis field, how it has unfolded in front of me in the last 10 years. I remember when I first sort of came into research and sort of looking at what NW were doing then, when they were just sort of a tiny little company, and what they've become, and watching what the industry has become. It's actually shocked me to see just quite how crazy the regulation is. On one hand, we have the medical cannabis market that has is where the off-license sort of traditional sort of cannabis plant being prescribed as a medicine in a way that seems rather unregulated to me. And I know you alluded to a moment ago, Blair, that there was sort of evidence for its efficacy, but that evidence is only in a very small number of indications compared to the number of indications for which it's currently being prescribed. And then looking at the other side of it for a licensed medicine, and how something like CBD, where you can pop down to Boots and buy as much as you want and consume it at your free will, but if you want to license it as a medicine, despite the good efficacy that we see in the data, you have to go through serious clinical trials costing millions of pounds, which is not particularly well supported in this country, unfortunately. For me, I guess what I really want to see now is the government kind of recognizing that and taking ownership of the industry, and taking ownership of what we have in this country, which is an excellent set of academic institutions who've done incredible science in this in the cannabinoid space, And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that all of that excellent work and all of that excellent foundation of science is just going offshore to be developed elsewhere, because it's so much easier to do that, and there's so many more schemes elsewhere to develop licensed medicines much more cheaply and much more sensibly. And furthermore, to take control of the other end of the industry, where we see the off-license side, so that not only do we have something that is safe, but something that is based in rigorous science, and something that's going to be sustainable and sustainable for growth. I think that that's probably going to look a lot like us developing, like you said, George, novel ways of collecting data, novel ways of looking at how we can regulate these products, how we can look for licensing. Cannabis, you know, I don't know how much anybody has any experience here. I won't embarrass anybody by asking them to put their hand up, but, you know, notoriously difficult to, you know, conduct placebo-controlled trials, that sort of thing. And so we have to accept that there are going to be new ways of collecting real-world evidence in order to advance ourselves much faster towards licensing things that we know to be effective, and know to be effective for a lot of disorders where we currently don't have very good options of treating them using the available medicines that are there. But I guess that's sort of over to the government, right, and how that they want to deal with it. And that's why I'm sort of here today trying to say, as scientists and as you know, pharmaceutical companies looking at this, we're here and we're ready to engage, and we're ready to look at new novel ways of doing it. But we just need the government to engage with us.
Excellent. Thank you very much, guys. I think just looking at the time, I might move us straight onto the Q&A. I can always pitch in with different questions at points based on what people want to ask. But essentially the format is that my two glamorous assistants will come around with the microphones. I'll take 2 questions at a time. And if you want a specific member of the panel to answer, please make that clear. As I say, no monologues, please. So we'll start off with the gentleman at the front here and the lady in the second row.
James Duckenfield, Glass Farms. Might quickly offer an alternative 3 categories for cannabis medicines, or the cannabis market, and that is licensed medicines, unlicensed medicines, and nutraceuticals. Mm-hmm. And I think there's meant to be 1.4 million self-medicators in that second unlicensed medicine category. And for me, it seems like the Home Office are the key problem in this country. And my question is really to George, is who can tell the Home Office to actually say that we want a medical cannabis market in this country, and sort out some of the blockages that they cause around scheduling of the drug in its precursor state to enable R&D, and the ridiculous 1 milligram rule for the CBD market?
Well, I think, George, I may think of an answer to that question, and Blair, it would also interesting to get your thoughts on that. Madam.
Hello, my name is Marika Graham-Woods, and I actually represent the Cannabis Trades Association, as well as being Hemel Hempstead Deputy Chairman. Thank you very much for having this discussion. I think one of the issues that you're seeking to grapple with is intellectual property right on a plant is a very difficult thing to achieve. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming that actually what you're trying to do is find devices or means of application for cannabis to enter the body, rather than trying to get an IP on, say, CBD as a product or cannabis sativa as a plant. Am I correct?
Is it to me?
Was that the extent of the question, Madam? Well, do you want to go and do you want to answer that straight away?
Well, yeah, sure. So what we've been looking to do is improve not only the bioavailability but the stability of CBD, because using it as you would as just a standard API, we know that it is incredibly unstable. We know that its absorption into the body is about 6% of what you take. So for us, it's about developing a product that is better than what we currently have. Of course, there's going to be a commercial interest in anybody's business, right? And so you want to protect your investment by using a method that you're going to have some ownership over. And I think that's exactly what GW have done. It's exactly what all of the other companies have done out there. And so I think that that's actually the best way that we move this market forward, is that we make it commercial for people in some sense. And also, we make the product much more usable. Right now, the CBD products that you buy out there on the shelves, in my opinion, pretty rubbish, because the product is unstable. You know, they've got, what, a year shelf life, if that. You know, the fact that whatever container they're in, half of it ends up stuck to the outside of it. Most of it is completely disregarded when taken orally. So if we can improve that, surely then we're reducing the amount of CBD that is required for indications where you're requiring 600 milligram doses, which in the current market would be a really high cost to someone like the NHS should we end up with a licensed medicine to use that kind of dose.
Thank you. And now on the first question.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I was dividing it politically, really. For a lay audience, as an MP, when I'm talking to people, if I talk about licensed medicines, unlicensed medicines, nutraceuticals, their eyes glaze over. But so I was trying to just do it politically. But you're dead right. Legally, licensed, unlicensed medicines and nutraceuticals is right. The key question really is the Home Office nut. How do you crack it? Steve and Blair have both got some insights on this. I'd just say, firstly, in the end, this will need political leadership from number 10 and 11, because the political optics of this, if you get it wrong, could very quickly get out of control. So there's a political argument. I happen to think that actually the Prime Minister's libertarian and the Chancellor's libertarian instincts and their growth urgency is pretty helpful. I mean, that's why I think this is quite a good conversation to be having. Look, if you really want to go libertarian and get some growth, here's one for you. I think the real nub of the question is in the Home Office, and Blair is dead right. But let's unpack it a bit. There's a degree of sort of not invented here, we're the securocrats, over our dead body. There's a group who pride themselves on, oh yeah, this is that lot, we'll stop them. But I think we can get around it. So Kit Malthouse, when he was policing minister, when I was doing the Tigger report, I contacted him and said, look, I'm going to put in a piece saying we should become a much more enlightened regulator of CBD, but I want to know whether how difficult is that for you? He said, look, I mean, basically I've got far bigger things to deal with, a whole raft of new street drugs that are killing kids, driving addiction. Frankly, if you want to grow some CBD hemp in Norfolk and regulate it properly to drive a big industry, yes. Now, I can't quite say it like that, but his instincts were that's a fight he could have. And I think then you've got an issue, I think genuine issues, if Home Office officials, are there any here? No? I think what they'd say is, we need to be clear that the growing of the crop is secure, that it isn't just a kind of, a back supply chain to the hippies who are stealing the crop out the back door. And I think that's where the sourcing and the supply chain, and that's certainly not what the Marquis of Townsend is thinking in Norfolk. He doesn't want people trampling. Then I think there's a processing piece, but that's licensing. The conditions of licensing would be you running a proper factory, it's secure, proper standards. And then there's a usage point, and they will argue, I think, well thin end of the wedge. Once you start licensing cannabinoid products, biscuits, bath oils, then you're just, I think that argument is just withering on the vine in the reality of Britain today. I think the bigger arguments are probably just, which are not hard to win. I think we've got to marshal the arguments. There is nothing about this other than your traditional and now out of date antipathy to anything beginning with cannabin. This is a growth industry. I think we can win this, but it'll require some quite smart footwork.
I think you're right. I think you're right about the political climate. I mean, obviously it's a bit chaotic at the moment, but if it ever does settle down in the weeks to come, then the debate about growth does provide a really perfect opportunity to really present this argument. I mean, the example that we often use, I think we used it in an early report this year, was one of the companies we onboarded about a year ago, Artello, and they came to us because they needed some help. So they were creating effectively, they were looking at undertaking a clinical trial in for what I would consider to be a blockbuster drug. So they're doing a trial in anorexia and palliative care. Half the people in palliative care suffer from anorexia. Now, they were stuck with the Home Office trying to get this license to undertake this study. And basically the company, which is headquartered in the US, had basically wanted to take this forward in Manchester. And they were on the verge of just pulling out of the UK. So I had to get in and notify ministers and things like that. I said, we're just literally, are we going to let Home Office officials impede the development of this potentially blockbuster drug. And it was, and the amount of effort we had to put in just to fast track that process to keep that company here in the UK was just madness. So I think it is, but I feel it just feels. I think what we said in Hodges, and I think Blair and Tom here are two of the principal architects who worked with Chris in that report, is it just needs a landing zone somewhere in the UK. That's the problem at the moment. But every time you have these conversations, about, in this case, this clinical trial, I had to go to about 3 departments to sort of get someone to actually, you've got to talk to them at MHRA, and the Home Office haven't talked to MHRA, and you've got to, and I think you talk to the business department, and I think really it needs, I think what I think what Blair and Chris and Tom argue in the report is that it does need it needs a landing zone so someone can there's someone who's got a vested interest in nurturing and growing this industry and can take these battles up with the Home Office and things like that. What the Home Office won't do, ever, because I've been around it for 20 years, they're not going to do anything to accommodate industry lobbyists as they see us, right? They're not going to do that. This has to come within government. This has to be, these changes have to take place within the policy engineering within government, right? And as soon as you get that, make those moves, and soon as you've got even a couple of civil servants sitting on Victoria Street who've got a responsibility for nurturing the industry, then these things can all just move much more quickly, right? But having none at all is a real barrier.
I mean, James is asked about who actually can make the Home Office do something. Well, the Home Secretary can make the Home Office do something. But if the Home Secretary themselves has gone native, then given their clout in Cabinet, as George says, it's really, it has to. You have to have a sympathetic Prime Minister when it at whatever point crosses her desk. If the Chancellor was particularly interested, I saw that a few times, particularly around issues like migration. So the Treasury can go toe-to-toe with the Home Office on migration any day of the week. No other department can. They sort of brush off the business department, DEFRA. But if you had a Prime Minister, a Chancellor, a Business Secretary, and a DEFRA Secretary, all aligned, then that trumps the Home Secretary. However strong and articulate they might be on the matter. So, it's early days. We'll wait and see, won't we? The new Home Secretary is very articulate. She's very smart. I've always thought that she's interested in the future, not harking back to the past. And I think we can, construct a bit of a narrative there. As George says, there's a sort of pro-growth agenda that both Bays and Treasury should be interested in. And then, DEFRA is the wild card, right? If DEFRA can make a compelling, narrow argument about the impact on the rural economy and net zero, then you start to sort of unpack it that way. So I'm not that pessimistic. I think at the moment it's too volatile to know how it will play out.
One thing I would like to come in on there, and I think various elements of the panel can bring me up on this, is that there's a stigma associated with, as George said, the word cannabis. And it's a stigma that obviously the Home Office that is opposed to anything that might be related to cannabis, etc. Is there a stigma that needs to be attacked both within government and also in the wider public, or is it succeeding on the latter?
I'd say two things. I think the first thing I would say is basically like all public policy related to cannabis. I think you agree with this, Barry Blair, is shrouded by the research of Professor Robin Murray. Right? I'll be honest with you. I mean, that's what I was told when I started getting involved in this. That Robin's research, which is seminal in this sense, has shrouded everything in Whitehall, because that fear of psychosis, things like that, shrouds everything, right? It makes everybody trepidatious, things like that. But I would say, I'll just tell you a story of how, what Sasha Java told me about when he was, I basically helped get this epileptic child entered into a clinical trial in Toronto in 2018. They were undertaking a clinical trial at Sick Kids, which is the equivalent of Great Ormond Street in Toronto. And he was prescribed cannabis on the Saturday and flew back on the red eye on the Sunday night. He arrived on Monday, and medicine was confiscated by Border Force. And then 4 or 5 days later, the kid's seizures came back, and he was rushed to Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. So there was a fear then for the kid's life. So there was a whole kind of panic that evening. It was a very hot summer evening. Initially, the Home Office were holding on to the idea that they would not issue this, and they wanted to go through this very complicated process of medical assessment. And we said no. And then we kept, and as the night went on, very late at the night, I just got a call from the Home Secretary saying, basically, just get the doctor to sign any piece of paper. And the very next morning, the doctor signed a piece of paper, and the drug was ferried from the bowels of the Home Office into the hands of the doctors at the Chelsea Westminster Hospital. So on Monday at Cabinet, Saj had to go to Cabinet and basically say to Cabinet, basically over the weekend, I had to issue this, I had to get this cannabis sent across to the sick child in hospital. And I'm going to recommend that we now refer this matter to the Chief Medical Officer. And the Prime Minister, Theresa May at the time, was furious with this, right? And only
She felt completely bounced.
Yes, completely very bad, but she refused to accept it and won't acknowledge or support it. And the only person who spoke up, I think, is Michael Gove. So Gove spoke for us. And but Saj has ignored her. He just went straight to the House. He went straight to the House and announced that he went straight to the House and asked. So that's what needs acts of political courage like that.
Yes.
Right. That's what it requires. Right. So basically, and as Blair said, with that 2 weeks later, the CMO had made the definitive case. Now, what that should have been is a trigger for economic development. It doesn't have a trigger to say, now we've accepted it's got therapeutic value, how do we basically begin to nurture this within our life sciences policy? But of course, the Home Office, the problem with all of this as well is because it happened through lobbying and through high-profile campaigns, the officials themselves become really kind of guarded, and they don't feel like they own this thing. They don't think they've had to do it under duress. And I saw this even in Canada when I went to look at Canada and spoke to officials in Health Canada with Blair 4 or 5 years ago. I could see there was a reluctance in Health Canada officials having to do any of this kind of stuff, right? You know. So ultimately, for all the machinations we're talking about, it does take an act of political courage to make this happen, right? I think it's what Saj done that day.
And in terms of language, to Will's point, I think there isn't much mention actually in Hodges of cannabis. We talk about hemp and cannabinoids, and I think that's the way to talk about it actually, because cannabinoids is actually the compounds that we're interested in, and hemp, as you know, of course, has much broader applications. So I don't use that word often, and other words associated with it I don't use, because it just plays into the hands of our sceptical opponents. But I think the language thing is important. Ministers generally don't know how to talk about drugs, generally. One thing about Kit Malthouse, which was a blessing, was that he not only knew what his focus should be in that role. He was interested in the idea of just offloading the licensing responsibility to somebody else. He wasn't somebody who was power hungry, who wanted to be signing these licenses and sticking his nose into the. So in that sense, you do need not just political courage. You need ministers who are willing to see the bigger picture.
Can I just say as well, to the point of is there a stigma around it? I think one of the huge issues we have is that there's a major lack of education around it. New news guys, you're actually all under the influence of cannabinoids as we speak, endocannabinoids that our body naturally produces that take part in this huge regulatory system in the body called the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system is very, very important in homeostatic regulation for many different reasons that I won't bore you about, but it isn't part of most curriculum for our doctors, for our biomedical scientists. It's astounding the lack of knowledge by medical professionals in this country around cannabis. And so it means when people are looking to engage with cannabinoid-based medicines, they are pushed to the fringes in order to find out information about it, and therefore get involved in groups that seem to enhance the stigma instead of making it,
I completely
much more
agree. As a
sensible.
former health minister for NICE and the MHRA and the regulatory approval and all the NHS drugs, there is a huge, every bit as strong as the Home Office instinct, there's a huge instinct in the health establishment that is very dismissive of anything that hasn't been through the traditional pharmaceutical process. And, I mean, very strong. So there's a huge cohort that I understand why they would be worried about snake oil salesmen approaching the NHS with unjustified claims. Of course, that's ridiculous. But it goes further than that. It's a professionalised, medicalised contempt for anything that hasn't come from that base. And you're right to flag it. That is equally important. I think one of the opportunities here is we cut through all this and just go data, data, data. There's a huge opportunity for the UK, by the way, to lead in. One of the other things I put in the Tigger report was digital health and clinical trials. We can start doing patient-observed outcome measures. You can start collecting the data from patients, not ask them to fill in on a form, did you take your CBD? We just trace it, and what were your actual biometrics? And you can start to make the UK a real home for digital clinical trials and test bedding. It's very exciting. You cut out all the politics and just gather the data. But there's as strong, you're right, as strong a problem in DH as there is in the Home Office.
Very good. Time for another couple of questions from the floor. So the gentleman over there and the gentleman on the end here.
If I could just pick up on what George was saying about the Department of Health. 9 years ago, I was involved in the e-cigarette struggle. And there, the aim of a lot of DH mandarins was to ban every e-cigarette product which wasn't a medicine, i.e. all e-cigarettes. And we've now got to a point where we have 4 million users of e-cigarettes in this country. And the blockages in there, George, you probably know that what was inside government dealing with those blockages. But my understanding was David Cameron, being a smoker, very helpful that Therese Coffey is also a smoker, was helpful in the sense of he got people understanding the real issues. And it's when politicians, and I'm talking about a whole range of issues I deal with, animal welfare, you name it, when politicians get involved in an issue on a personal basis, change happens. So how can we encourage politicians in the cabinet to have more involvement, he says mischievously, on this matter, so that 1,000 flowers might bloom, rather than any medicinal establishment or Home Office securitats playing blocking, or as we're seeing in the energy sector, just to be even more Catholic in the number of sectors.
So we do have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to go to the question from the other gentleman. Sorry, you've had your time, sir.
Question for George. I'm Mark Tugger from TTS Pharma. George, a lot of we're one of the beneficiaries of over 3 million of government funding. Thank you very much. It's all being spent largely on academic research and Aberystwyth. We've had a large number of clinical trials running for the last 3-4 years under Home Office licenses. One of the issues, and I think Grace has brought it up in regards to the brain drain, companies going overseas, people going to the States to raise capital. When you take the Innovate funding, which is given out here to companies, small companies with great ideas, it equates to NIH funding in America. If you get NIH funding, you go to the top of the list for a public supply contract. So when smaller companies are trying to raise capital on the basis of the next milestone that they've hit, next IP, et cetera, they're able to demonstrate contracts with the government which they've been funded with. Now, obviously, if they don't hit the performance milestones...
Similar principle. Can we get to the question, please?
The question is, can you see that happening in our lifetime? Because it'd be great if Innovate could connect into that kind of revenue line.
Thank you. George, do you want to...
Yeah, let me take them in reverse order. So that is exactly what I was putting in place through the accelerated access reform. So the huge problem in the UK, we're brilliant at research, we're terrible through the NHS at actually procuring and adopting anything. The NHS is a pretty unique organisation in terms of its dysfunctional purchasing structures. I mean, there's thousands of committees and layers. But having run lots of startup companies, even if you don't buy at volume, just the first purchase order proven to work in the NHS would be a massive valedictory moment for a lot of startups. And so the accelerated access reform was about establishing a first little purchase point where you say, this technology has been proven to be safe, it's been through the early access to medicine scheme, it works. The NHS isn't about to buy it for every single patient for £1 billion, but it's validated, proven, and here's your first purchase order. And that would be a phenomenal breakthrough for a lot of innovative technology companies who then may go all around the world. But we're very close to it, but it shouldn't require the level of push that it does, but it is completely key. And the American model is right. Unfortunately, in Innovate, which I was Minister for in my last role, there is almost no connection, no join-up between departments, and the doctrine at Bayes is we don't fund success, we don't pick winners, we dabble in market failure. And unless that is changed, that is the doctrine. Unless that is changed, we will never back winners successfully. And so, to your point about e-cigarettes, it's a good question. How do we win the hearts, I think, is what you're really saying. How do we win the hearts and minds of the political leaders? And I just observed that for me, I first kind of got into it because I could see at a very base level of bioscience, knowing that cannabinoids are naturally occurring products, they play a role in the body as it is, then clearly that's a mechanism for scientific endeavour. And when I was a VC looking at novel mechanisms of action for novel compounds, you'd be daft not to look at it. But where the penny really dropped is when my great friend, former soldier, did 2 tours in Northern Ireland, never smoked or drank, told me he had brain cancer. He's now dead, sadly. And he sat 6'4" of fit, midlife young man in tears, saying the only thing that helped him with his night psychosis was a CBD product, and the only place he could buy it was illegally under the bridge, criminalising him. That really cuts through, and I promised him as he died that I would campaign to get the law changed. And I think the brain cancer community has got, those communities really mobilise. So I think there's something about getting people to realise, the living human beings around the cabinet table, that there are a lot of people suffering, and these products are incredibly powerful. And if that doesn't win it, then there's also a huge economic argument.
Steve?
I would just add that we're going to get there, I think. The reasons to be cheerful, I think, look at Australia, a country of less than half the population of the UK, but 250,000 prescriptions in the last full calendar year. If we get to a point of having, say, 20,000, 30,000 prescriptions a month, that's enough population coverage eventually over time that there will be MPs whose direct family members are receiving a prescription and benefiting from it. So we will get there.
Yeah. The other thing that's going to happen next year, hopefully next year, is the Government's Committee on Toxicity will declare CBD safe, which has basically been holding the whole global regulatory framework up, right? Yeah. So basically, the FDA won't touch it because they haven't seen the safety data. So we designed our own tox study, as some of you know, and we've shared that with the Committee on Toxicity in the last few months. And I think that moment will be a really interesting trigger, because I know from the webinars that we do every month that the first companies that sign up for these webinars are all the big FMCG companies, Nestle, Unilever. They sign up for everything we do, right? They engage at every level, right? So I think the institutional investment community, I think, is holding back, willing to get that declaration. But just last month, or just early in the summer, the European Union, through EFSA, their regulator have actually set out their criteria for regulating product as food, regulating CBD as a food as well. And there's a bit of an arms race going on at the moment around getting data packages together to accelerate that process as well. We're quite involved in that at the moment as well. So I think there is, that will be quite a huge boon as well going forward, because I think there is, and as I say, I think the companies we've onboarded in the last few months have all been asking us for help around new product development. Like, we're not getting anybody coming to us who wants to put CBD in a bottle. They all want to basically, they want to talk about, like, as I say, akin to what people were talking about omega-3 20 years ago. And that's brilliant. I think it's a really interesting development.
Grace, do you have anything on either of those questions, or are you?
I do now, I've forgotten it. Coming to the point of, and unfortunately, good, solid science and clinical data isn't enough to persuade the government to make decisions, which is rather sad, and it's something I see a lot in. I work for a veterans charity who use psychedelics to treat PTSD, and we recognise there that no matter how much data we throw at the problem, it's when you get the actual person in front of somebody and can show them the difference that using these medicines can make to those lives, which is what changes policy. And I think that's what we are going to hopefully see happening more and more in the cannabis space and in the cannabinoid space. And so what Steve was saying there about CBD and how we're looking to utilise this in the future, I guess we've kind of been alluding a lot to the idea of this being a medicine for major illness, which of course it has shown great efficacy in a number of areas. But another thing is that CBD is a wellness product, and we are kind of seeing through the way that it interacts with a number of different receptors in the body and all the rest of it, it has a great potential for helping us all live well, how about we don't wait until we're all, majorly diseased before we try and sort ourselves out? And actually, perhaps the application of CBD in a similar way that we applied omega-3 to our lives wouldn't be a bad thing. And perhaps it comes more towards a more holistic approach that we all start to take in our lives, so that we can live healthier and longer and happier.
Yeah, I mean, the piece of data that I think is interesting is two pieces of data really. One is Kantar doing some work for us around the consumer trends, and for 3 consecutive months, I think it's just the start of this year, they've a survey of 100,000 consumers who are sharing all their receipts online and offline, and they came to us because for 3 consecutive months, more than 10% of the British population were consuming CBD products. And but in the polling that we conducted for Hodges, I think it's up to half of the people who were polled said they wouldn't use a CBD product because they were concerned about its legality, its safety, its provenance, So it just seems to me there's still huge amount of growth potential in there if we can crack those sort of issues around safety and efficacy.
Okay, just to round up the event then, I would like to ask George, finally, you spoke a lot about how we need to change how we regulate innovation, science in this country, etc. How do you think this industry can be a test case for how we can create a new post-Brexit regulatory framework that does make us that world leader in scientific innovation that we want to be? Not really a small
I'm
question,
here
but,
because I think you're perfectly poised for it. You've got a Prime Minister whose instincts are libertarian, and the Chancellor the same, and a cabinet in that image. We've got a very clear message we want to go for growth. We've got a government hungry for Brexit opportunities. Well, this is a major Brexit regulatory opportunity. That's why I put it in the TIGA, Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform. So that's 3 big political doors open. And by the way, that report, in which we set out a new framework for regulation in the UK post-Brexit, and then 10 hot, high-growth sectors, of which this was one, it was signed off by the Cabinet. It's supposed to be being implemented, and until I left government, I was working with Jacob Rees-Mogg on implementing it, me on the growth sectors, him on the framework. So I think we're in a really strong position, and actually I'm more optimistic about this than I am much of the other stuff I've been talking about at conference today. I think the doors are all open. You've got some people behind the campaign who know how to do it, who are proven. I think in Hodges, Professor Chris Hodges, we have a real leader who's taken seriously. There's a perfect opportunity, and I'd like next year for the hall to be packed with Conservatives saying, why aren't we unleashing the power of this new industry that could really drive growth, give the rural economy a boost, help us be a global leader, use our regulatory freedoms post-Brexit to create a whole new industry.
Excellent. And on that bombshell, I'll draw the event to close. Ladies and gentlemen, please can we have a big hand for our wonderful panel.
Thank you, William.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for coming along. And